We're here at SUNY Maritime in the Bronx, a beautiful place, by the way.
It's gorgeous.
Where they are breaking ground on an offshore wind workforce development program, something you secured funding for. You have an enormous platform. Of course, you have since you were elected. Why is the climate crisis an issue you've spent so much political capital on?
Well, you know, I think up until now, up until very recently, it's been very difficult to generate political momentum around addressing climate change, especially on the scale that we need to be addressing it on. And there are so many issues that are so critically important, and we're very lucky to have very strong political coalitions. But I know that when I was running, this was something that was just beginning to emerge, that same kind of political force and saliency around addressing the climate crisis. And so now it continues to be a really important priority, not just for me, but I think for many policymakers, because we also have to handle this in a way that actually addresses the injustices that working class people and communities of color have faced in the climate crisis as well.
You just reintroduced the Green New Deal. When you talk about big, expensive programs, that's where you sometimes hit resistance, I think. How do you convince those people who believe climate change is real, it is a crisis, but they're concerned that some of these proposed solutions are too grand or too expensive?
Yes, well, you know, I think it is important to acknowledge that the scale and the scope of what we are proposing is massive, but the scale and the scope of the climate crisis is even bigger. And if we are not proactive about very aggressively and transformationally addressing our infrastructure, our workforce, our preparation for the climate crisis, then the costs of not addressing it are going to be far greater.
You're a very effective communicator. You've talked about how the climate crisis impacts communities of color and communities that people don't talk about a lot. Sometimes people think of the climate crisis as like something that latte drinking liberals who are hugging trees only care about.
Yeah.
So what is the most effective message in terms of the impact on the next generation that you've found?
The climate crisis represents a challenge, a storm that will hit all of us, but we will not all be in the same boat. And working class communities that do not have the infrastructure that they need are going to be hit hardest. And communities of color that have been historically redlined to be deprived of already existing infrastructure are going to be hit hard as well.
There are a lot of myths and misinformation about the Green New Deal out there. You may like even more than I do disputing disinformation, and I like it quite a bit. But let's go through some of these. Former President Donald Trump has said that in the Green New Deal, you're, quote, not allowed to own cows anymore.
You know, I wish Donald Trump had read legislation while he was president. Clearly, he hasn't read this. It is absolutely not true. In fact, we discuss a lot about renewable agriculture and having proactive investments for small farmers across the country.
So cows are allowed, just to be clear.
Cows are totally allowed.
Cows are
Ranchers and are going to be a very important partner in addressing this.
Green New Deal, Ocasio-Cortez aims to make air travel obsolete, aid those unwilling to work. That's a lot in a headline.
Yeah.
But what do you say to that? Well,
I represent LaGuardia Airport, and we stand with especially our flight attendants unions and our airline workers a lot. And really, it truly is the climate crisis itself that threatens airline travel with increasing storms and flooding airports. It really is posing a very large threat to our airline industry and infrastructure. So this is actually the opposite. we have to make sure that we're making the investments necessary so that we're helping folks.
During Texas's 2021 winter blackout, Governor Greg Abbott said, quote, the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal, and blamed frozen windmills and renewable energy for the blackouts.
Well, we know that Governor Abbott was actually covering for a lot of the oil and gas industry infrastructure that was failing because the Republican governor refused to make the proper investments in the grid in Texas. And so he was really covering up his own failure to properly invest in his own oil and gas infrastructure by blaming it on a congresswoman from New York for legislation that has not affected the state of Texas.
Between the time when you first introduced the Green New Deal and now, the Inflation Reduction Act passed something you worked very hard on as well. It contained the most ambitious pieces of climate legislation to date, $369 billion in climate and energy investments. So for people who care about this but are wondering, why do we need another climate package? You just passed one. What should people understand is in the Green New Deal that wasn't addressed in the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, I think two things are possible at once. The Inflation Reduction Act was an enormous victory. It represents the largest climate action that the U.S. government has taken in American history, but it also is not in and of itself sufficient for us to address this crisis. This is something that we are going to have to be tackling for our entire lives. This was a good down payment, but there were very real political challenges that we had to confront during that time, particularly support around major investments around public housing, public transit, environmental justice for those disproportionately impacted communities. And by and large, really, the investments that are going to be necessary to transition us to renewables are going to require much more investment beyond that very important, promising down payment in the
more
IRA.
Public housing, more to do work to help address environmental justice issues.
Yes.
There's more work to be done.
Absolutely. And union protections to make sure that the folks that are actually being put to work to build this infrastructure are being paid in strong, dignified union jobs.